Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, welcome to the final University of Auckland Early Childhood Seminar Series seminar for 2024. We'll begin our time together with karakia. Me inoi tātou. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa ponamu te moana, hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa. Huie, hai kie. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation by Dr. Hazel Woodhouse from the University of Waikato. We're delighted to have Hazel with us to share her research exploring the vital role of partnerships between educational settings and families in facilitating children's transitions to school. If questions arise for you during the presentation that you would like to ask Hazel, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and she'll respond to them throughout her at the end of her presentation. You can also use the chat function throughout the presentation to connect with each other and the panelists. After the seminar, a recording will be available on our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel. I will now pass over to Professor Helen Hedges to welcome and introduce Dr. Woodhouse. Kia ora, Helen.
Kia ora, Justine. Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki tēnei hui. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Hazel Woodhouse, who's recently obtained a lecturer role at the University of Waikato. As you will hear very clearly shortly, Hazel has roots in England, where she began her career as a teacher. She's taught in England and New Zealand in early childhood and primary settings, specialising in the reception or new entrants areas. Hence, the transition from early childhood education to school has occupied her thoughts for many years. Hazel took the opportunity to research this transition for her PhD. She considered a perspective often overlooked, that of the parents and families involved rather than the teachers or children per se. Originally intending to observe and support a colleague for her PhD, teaching assignment changes in the school meant that Hazel's study turned into a practitioner research project, something suited to her because she is so passionate about her own practice. Today, we will hear about her use of Facebook as a digital tool. Hazel used Facebook to facilitate understanding and communication about transition as a period of children's and families' lives that actually occurs over a long period of time. In this way, Hazel fostered a community of practice tailored for and specific to the needs of her children and families. I'm sure you'll be as fascinated by Hazel's project as I was. So over to you, Hazel.
Ngā mihi kia koutou. Thank you, Justine and Helen, for a lovely warm welcome. Thank you. Good evening, I'm Hazel, and I've been given the absolute privilege of sharing some of my research into developing a collaborative transition process to school with families and teachers across the early childhood and primary sectors using social media. So I'll start this evening at the very beginning of the story with some of the observations that I was making in my role, which Helen told you at the time was a new entrant teacher and a new entrant team leader, who was responsible for transitioning our new entrant children and families into our primary school. My observation of how these practices were actually responsive to transitioning families' needs is what prompted this research focus. So beginning with a bit of background of the families, the majority of our families who entered our new entrants worked full-time. This meant that they were largely time poor in being able to attend meetings or transition activities at school, particularly if these occurred during the school day or on certain weekday evenings. However, the families were keen to be involved. I received emails from families sharing that they couldn't make a meeting, but still had questions and wanted to be part of their child's transition. When this research commenced, early childhood settings were using app-based technologies such as StoryPark and Seesaw, and these technologies were fast becoming their main communication tools with families. We were a large primary school with over 40 early childhood settings feeding into our new entrant classes over the year. Reciprocally, these early childhood settings were also navigating children's transition with a number of schools. Transition, therefore, for both early childhood and our new entrant setting was complex, and the process of developing communication between early childhood settings and our school and initiating and maintaining that was difficult. These initial wonderings from literature began to shape the 3 research questions that guided this research. Question 1 explored how we could develop from a one-size-fits-all approach that we were currently operating for transitioning families towards a collaborative process with the families themselves being involved. Question 2 explored the potential of developing 2 online meeting spaces to talk and problem solve about transition to school, and to see if these 2 groups could each become a community of practice. Question 3, well, this final question involved learning about the children from the children themselves and from those who knew them best, their early childhood teachers and their families, in order for me, as the new person entering their world, to facilitate a responsive transition to welcome and support each child who was joining our class community. What I'll do is I'll start by exploring the material relevant to research questions 1 and 2, and then after that, I'll return back to research question 3, sharing more about my findings relevant to facilitate the children's transition separately. So just a little information about the context of this research. 2 early childhood settings amongst the 3 selected that you can see on the screen were deliberately chosen to be not in walking distance of the school, so they had to be more than 5 kilometres. This was because a large number of children were attending settings that were located nearer their parents' workplace, and so navigating this physical distance between early childhood settings and school was part of the challenge of being able to include all families, and why selecting an accessible form of technology as a communication tool was a key consideration for this study. I'll let you read the numbers, but one point that I will draw your attention to is the 20 in total families at the bottom of your screen. I began the research with the focus families from each of the 3 settings, as you can see in the boxes on the screen. But there was cause during the research, which I will pick up on shortly, for me to return to the Ethics Committee and ask permission for the rest of the new entrant classes families to be added to the family Facebook group. Also, it is worth noting at this point that the primary school operated a system of children starting school on or after their 5th birthday, and so did not use a group cohort entry system. In terms of my selected methods, I drew upon a number of methods in my research, but today I'm focusing on Facebook as this was the most continuous method maintained over the study. In Facebook, I set up 2 closed groups, one for the families and one for the teachers. Both groups were discussing transition to school, but it was felt that each group had their own unique agenda. The teachers group was purposed for discussing their professional transition practices, whereas the parents was more on discussing how to support their child at home to help them manage their transition with their child. Closed groups in Facebook means that only those invited can join, and as the administrator who established the group, I'd receive a notification if somebody wanted to join the group, and could only do so if I approved the notification. So I was basically a bit of a gatekeeper to the groups. Closed also means that any material shared within the group space stays in the group space. It cannot be reposted outside of the group by any of the members. One consideration was I did need to prompt the group members to check their privacy settings of their own personal Facebook accounts, just to ensure that they were happy with the level that they had set themselves. And perhaps they may not have reviewed these settings for a wee while. As you can see from my initial postings to the two groups, this was how I set up the purpose for coming together as a group. I'll just move that out of the way. As you can see from my initial postings to the groups, this was how I set up the purpose for coming together as a group in the two online spaces. I hoped that in each of the groups, having a clear purpose to set the agenda for the group, that perhaps an online community of practice could be fostered. So what is a community of practice? Well, a community practice can be developed by a group who meet either face-to-face or virtually in an online environment. My research mostly focuses on the cultivation of an online community of practice using the Facebook group spaces, but acknowledges the influence of face-to-face opportunities for group members to connect socially to build on their connections formed online. In their community of practice framework, Wenger, McDermott and Snyder, 2002, Wenger et al. 2002, hereafter, identify the purpose for cultivating a community practice as a way to foster innovation and creative problem solving as part of a group. They define a community of practice as a group of people who share a concern, set of problems, or a passion about a topic, and who deepen their knowledge and expertise in this area by interacting on an ongoing basis. And that's pages 4 to 5. And I've got the references at the end for you if you would like to read further on that. So in order for a group and their engagement to be identified as a community of practice, Wenger et al. 2002 stipulate the presence of 3 fundamental elements. Firstly, the domain, the cause, the goal, or the purpose that brings the group together, just like that initial posting that I shared with you on the other slide, which in the case of my research was transition to school. Secondly, the practice, which refers to the tools and the language that is developed by a group. Well, in the Facebook groups, this was evidenced through postings, but also through the use of emoji. As well as that, the bank of transition resources that were developed and the previous and current postings, which created an ongoing record of the group activity. Thirdly, the community element, which is a little bit more trickier that I felt in my study. This refers to the interaction and engagement of the group members. So in my analysis of each group member's activity in their Facebook group, I interpreted interaction a little differently from engagement. That way I could clearly categorize each group member's activity and participation within their space. Interaction was interpreted as a group member interacting with the content with the group space. So for example, a group member would come into the group space, they would read the postings, they would take the information that they needed from those postings, and then they would exit the group and only return to do a similar sort of action on a frequent basis. But these group members tended not to engage with other members of the group or the material online by leaving any messages or using emoji. Engagement was interpreted as a group member commenting on the Facebook content through emoji and or responding to postings or initiating postings, and was also evidenced when they responded to other people's comments and feedback. In my analysis, a parent's or teacher's engagement demonstrated an increased presence as an individual that contributed to the group and the direction and decision making of the transition process. So therefore, those who tended to engage, particularly with other group members, were interpreted as being more likely to become part of a community through developing connections and bonds with the other group members. Alongside the community of practice framework, which focused on the group's activity, The transition theory that underpinned the research was Van Gennep's 3 phases of transition. These 3 phases are identified and described by Van Gennep as being preliminal, where the individual or group of individuals separate from their previous environment. It's worth noting that this separation may occur before the physical detachment from a group and can align to that mental, emotional detachment an individual undergoes as they process their forthcoming exit of a community. The liminal is described as that in-between phase or standing on the threshold, ready to go. And at the post-liminal, as the incorporation of the transitioning individual or group of individuals into their new social group. Van Gennep's 3 phases of transition provided the lens to interpret the family's transition to school. The 3 phases supported viewing transition as an evolving and changing process over time, emphasizing the importance of a flexible facilitation by a teacher to support families' changing needs. So the preliminal was interpreted as being whilst the families were still part of the early childhood community. The liminal interpreted as the children started on school visits, when parents started to visit the school office to get their stationery or order uniforms, and the children's actual very first day. The post-liminal was viewed as being in a time frame of around about 1 term after the child started school, and indications could be observed that the child was starting to find their feet in their new role and environment. It's worth pointing out here as well at the post-liminal phase, the children actually finished school in December, and that would be the end of that new entrant class. So there was a cutoff as to how long I could watch and observe the children looking for indications of post-liminality. Underneath the 3 phases, as you can see, at the preliminal, my engagement in building connections with the transitioning families was mostly through Facebook. So you can see the digital engagement. During the liminal, this was a mixture of Facebook engagement, but also the face-to-face function of families attending social events at the school. And we'll talk a bit more about these later on too. The post-liminal, well, Facebook ran alongside school for some families, so they had face-to-face and online. But for others, their connections with school were only maintained through Facebook. Using Van Gennep's theory, I examined the purposes for my postings initiated within the family's Facebook group over the 3 phases of the transition process. At the preliminal phase, my postings were mainly focused on preparation, informing the families about school, developing resources that could be used at home to spark conversations that might help parents prepare their child for school. At the liminal phase, my postings were more purposed on responding to parent questions, a welcome post for each child, and providing reassurance to parents through the day-to-day sharing of the children at school. Now, this last particular focus was what parents wanted to know about the most, as a lot of parents were at work and they wanted to know about their child's day at school. In the post-liminal, the continuation of the everyday postings, along with any updates of any upcoming school events or responding to the odd question from parents. Through my analysis of the purpose of postings, it helped me to think more about my facilitation of transition and how I could develop opportunities to get to know my transitioning families and their needs. So, what did a model of facilitation for a teacher supporting a collaborative transition guided by the 3 phases of transition to school look like? Well, here it is. Well, here's mine anyway. At each of the 3 phases, guided by Van Gennep's framework for transition, is an identified deliberate act of transition, or DAT for short. So DATs were purposed to be an overarching objective to help guide a teacher's facilitation of families' transition to school over each of the 3 phases of transition. Within each overarching DAT, key ensuing actions were identified as being instrumental to providing support towards the overall objective of building relationships, shown by those grey arrows coming through the middle. Ensuing examples of these actions developed in my research are provided in this model, as you can see, but an ensuing action is intended to be open to the interpretation of any teacher to best fit their particular context and their particular group of families' needs. Drawing on the 3 phases highlights the changing needs of the families over time and how facilitation can be targeted in a timely way to meet these needs by identifying key points of change in the family's process. So let's have a look at some examples of these DATs and ensuing actions. And this is the fun stuff. So at the preliminal phase, whilst the families were still part of their early childhood communities, the DAT that focused the teacher's facilitation was making connections. I'll briefly explore examples of 2 ensuing actions related to this deliberate act of transition. This next slide shows the first example of how the school principal shared his story with the families to introduce himself to them. The children really connected with the details that he chose to share, and this prompted parents to respond with postings from their child, sharing about things like their pets' names and what they like to do at home.
Mr. Sutton is our school principal. Even though he comes to school every day, he does not sleep there. Sometimes on our weekend, we might see Mr. Sutton at a cricket or a rugby match. You also might see him shopping at Chartwell or Campden. Mr. Sutton and his wife have 6 grown-up children, 14 grandchildren. He also has a cat and a dog. Mr. Sutton likes to take his dog, Kara, for a walk. Mr. Sutton also likes to plan to look forward to his holiday. But he also loves to see all of the children and families at school.
I'm a little bit nervous there because I've got a brand new puppy, and when that dog barked, I've just heard her barking too, so I'll quickly move on. In providing families with the tools to use at home to prepare their child for starting school in a way that worked for them, I developed a series of videos based on a 5-year-old child called Patrick. They were purposed to see school through a new 5-year-old's eyes. They were designed for children, with prompting questions throughout the short videos so parents could pause if they wished and discuss aspects of the video. The videos were guided by Maslow's pyramid of needs that you can see on the screen. And at each level of the pyramid, you can see a scenario which aligned to social situations children would likely experience at school, as identified by the teachers and families in the initial questionnaire at the start of the research. To customize this research to my particular family's needs, these stories were also translated into Mandarin. Additional Patrick videos were added through parent requests around additional aspects of children's transition. The next slide shares an example of a Patrick story which focuses on the first level of the pyramid. What should I do when I really need the toilet?
Patrick needs the toilet. He is desperate, he asks the teacher.
Off you go.
When Patrick gets to the toilet, someone is already there. else could Patrick do? If you weren't sure, what would you do?
And that was my two nephews at the time they were very young, starring in the Patrick role and his little friend. So just moving on to the liminal phase, the overall deliberate active transition, or DAT, was developing engagement. Now this held 3 ensuing actions, which I'll briefly explore. So parents' requests and questions was another example of providing families with the information that they needed to support their child. One hot topic was lunchtime. As you can see from the parents' postings, parents were concerned about the supervision of their child, the culture shock for them with so many children and the busyness, general care such as applying sunblock, food allergies, and even being able to walk home themselves. Similarly, early childhood teachers too held some concerns for children at lunchtime. As you can see, they identified children's confidence, their well-being, making friends as challenges for their transitioning children, made from the observations that some of them have seen of the schools around their area, where they can see the children outside. The result from the Facebook groups was that the teachers proposed the introduction of lunchtime transition sessions. These sessions were then offered to families, which they were very pleased to be involved with. And then the timings of these sessions were organised using the Facebook polling system with the families, and that way we could select dates that were going to work for the families. As I mentioned before, in adding new resources, the Patrick stories were intended for use at home. Well, that's what they were purposed for families. But I did discover from the teachers that they were also using the videos in their centres too, which was amazing. A further story was added to these resources, and this is an example of how the stories were added to in response to a parent posting that you can see on the left of your screen about how to familiarise her child with the after-school care service. And you can see a little screenshot of Patrick at after-school care there. Facebook has a great range of tools which can be used to share moments of the day. One tool which was especially successful was live stream. I used Facebook to publicise the event, and in this case, it was a language play lesson around lemons. The parents were really responsive, and as we streamed it from the classroom, the family's comments floated up the screen so I could share them with the children. And for the parents and children, it felt like we were all part of this learning in the same room, which for one mum, she was very emotional because she was watching the live stream from Australia due to being away for work. And so it was so great. So also at the liminal phase, and what I said earlier about community practice, about valuing those opportunities for face-to-face social events, this is at the point in time where social events came into play. So at the liminal phase, because up until this point, all of my engagement with families was online, as I'd use Facebook as the place to orient and prepare families during the preliminal phase. As we drew nearer to the children starting school, I prioritised any face-to-face time at school to be used to build social connections. With this in mind, 2 social events were held, and each was planned on Facebook to gain maximum support from the families and the teachers. The polling system was particularly effective in arranging dates and times very quickly and very easily. You can see a little sample at the bottom there of how that works. The first event, the Rock Hunt, was a great way to get children and parents mixing and exploring the school grounds, hunting for painted rocks hidden around school. The second, the Whakatoa, was an opportunity to welcome early childhood teachers and families to our school community to be welcomed all together as a group. So returning to the point I made earlier about that new total of 20 families, this decision was made due to my observations that I made at the Whakatoa. This is where I had an opportunity to notice, and this was great, how comfortable and confident my focus families were with each other. Bearing in mind, a lot of them didn't know each other before. They were comfortable and confident in approaching myself and the principal, and how they were sharing information with the other families who were not part of the Facebook group about starting school. So amazing. It had obviously, been such a positive experience for them. But as a new entrant teacher, and as Helen said at the beginning, for all of the families, this did not sit well with me. And so I went back to ethics and I applied to add all of the families in my new entrant class to give them the opportunity to be part of the family Facebook group. So finally, the post-liminal phase. Facebook was maintained after all the children had started school. I did not know when I started the whole thing just how long the Facebook group's lifespan would be, but it was clear at this point in time at the post-liminal phase that the increased family and teacher interaction and engagement in both groups was still thriving. This meant that the groups were still relevant and valuable to their members. Another aspect of continuing the group that become more obvious in my ongoing analysis of the postings was that parents began to respond to each other's needs and questions within their group space, and it became a little bit of a space for a parent network to start to foster. And here's an example of one. Because each child started school on or near their 5th birthday, this meant that some children started school in August, whilst others right up until mid-November. Also evident, such as in the question posted on your screen, was that parents experiencing transition with their first child would use the Facebook group to ask for advice from parents who'd been through the process before. So this first-time parent was anxious about separating from her child and so posted a question on the group page. You might have noticed that she addresses the posting to me, but I deliberately didn't respond straight away. I deliberately took a step back and I let the parents who were the experts respond to her parenting question, and did so in such a positive way, as you can see on the screen. The result of which, the tips did help, and the parent reposted to say thank you so much for everybody's advice, just so I can finish that little story. So going back to the research questions 1 and 2, in conceptualizing the findings for research question 1, the deliberate acts of transition, or DATs, provided an overarching objective to guide a teacher's facilitation of each family's transition to school over the 3 phases of transition, with the overall objective of building relationships. Within each DAT were identified ensuing actions, and ensuing actions were designed to be open to interpretation for a teacher to decide on specific actions or practices that met their family's particular needs. And even though I was a new entrant teacher year in, year out, each family cohort that came through were very, very different in their specific needs. Research question 2, well, Facebook provided the place for a group of families or teachers to meet. It was then up to the individual how they chose to interact and engage within the group space. Was there evidence of a community of practice? Well, the fundamental elements of domain and practice was evident within the Facebook group spaces. However, a feeling of contributing towards a community was interpreted as being subjective to an individual's choice in how they engage with the rest of the group. So as I mentioned at the start, I'll start to have a quick look through the children's my facilitation of the children's transition relating to research question 3. So I'll share some examples of how the 3-phase transition process supported each child's transition, because it's a little bit different from the families and teachers. At the preliminal phase, facilitation was focused on preparing a learning environment that was responsive to the children's interests, so that when they arrived, they could build a connection to their new learning space. I gained a lot of that information from the children's online early childhood portfolios, which the 3 centres gave me access to at the start of the research. And at this point in time, the children's transition for portfolios shared by each of the early childhood centres with us as a New Entrants team. The transition portfolio was a very special document that the centres shared, and we as a New Entrant team were grateful to receive it and helping us to get to know the children. And it was often placed in a box in our classroom in the book corner so the children could retrieve their portfolio whenever they wished to look through the photos and share them with the other children. Secondly, a really surprising finding about how families used Facebook to prepare their child for school is on the next slide. It's in the form of a vignette. This vignette from my researcher's notes shares how parents used Facebook as a way to introduce their child to their new friends. So Connor came to school for his first visit on Thursday. He was extremely excited to come to class. He pointed to the children and clung to Mum, saying, "That's Mason, oh, and Morgan, and that is Camden." I asked him if he knew the children from Kindy or near his home, and his mum replied, "Oh, no, he has watched all the videos and looked at all the photos, so he knows who everyone is." Connor appeared starstruck when he watched Mason at lunchtime. Mason waved at him from the climbing frame, and Connor gave a shy little wave, remarking to Mum, "Mason just waved at me." I was so surprised when the new children arrived to school already knowing children's names and faces in their class. And this particular child, Connor, his mum said to me, he's painfully shy. She says, "I've never seen him come into a new space with lots of people and just want to be here." So it was such a lovely surprise to see how the parents were creatively using Facebook to connect their children to friends before they started. At the liminal phase, the rehearsing of aspects of the school day came through strongly in the children's role play. As you can see in the photo with the 2 girls with backpacks, Morgan has her school bag, and her group of friends also had their school bags and prams and everything and lunch boxes. And for a number of days, they rehearsed their before school routine, such as making lunch at home, packing bags, and then walking to school and dropping the children off at school. And this went on for about 2 weeks, pretty much every day. Next to this image, you can also see the block people, which was a big hit with the children. Basically, it was a wooden block with an image of the child, which some of the children named their mini me. The children used the block people to replicate characters, such as superheroes in their play, to figure out aspects of transition through rerunning imagining scenarios through the role of a superhero. One example was a little boy in the blocks who had a big ball of string, and he was using his block person as Spider-Man to swing between the buildings. And he was trying to figure his way out to the rugby courts where the children played at lunchtime. And he kept on getting lost, and he was rerunning it and rerunning it. And as a New Entrant teacher for nearly 30 years, I was actually having my eyes opened at how children figure out transition through their play. It's important to note that this project only allowed enough time for some children to enter post-liminality of their transition. My observations that were interpreted as evidence of children entering post-liminality were seeing them playing together, making connections socially, and in some cases, supporting new children who had started school. As the children found their feet, evidenced in the day-to-day postings that I shared in the teacher's Facebook page, often the child's previous teacher would address a post to the child directly and say how proud they were and how they were seeing examples of confidence and belonging to their new class through making friends and looking after other children. And that really consolidated my observations of post-liminality when they were noticing similar factors. Here's an example of a child supporting another child in adapting to school. So Morgan's the little blonde girl on the left, and Josie's the little girl you'll see in the dark blue with the ponytail on the other photos. So one example of a child supporting another child and adapting to school was observed when Morgan, who'd been at school longer, and she initially struggled with separation from mom, found comfort in a routine with a dress-up rainbow tail that she wore daily. She would get it out the box in the morning, wear it all day, and then leave it at the door every single evening when she left. And you can see her in the photo with the tail. When Josie, a new student, started school feeling really overwhelmed, Morgan noticed that she was upset and, being kind, offered her the tail as a comforting gesture. Josie then adopted the same routine as what Morgan had, finding comfort in the tail. She'd leave it at the door on the end of the day and pop it back on the next morning. Now, this shows how children can begin to support each other as they grow and find their feet as they start school. So overall, for families, social media has shown that it can bridge parent availability and provides a way for families to be involved in their child's transition. Through Facebook, I could get to know what families needed, what worked and what didn't, so that I could adapt transition practices. Providing families with tools and resources meant that they were informed and that they could support their child's start to school at a time and in a way that worked for them as a family. Facebook freed up the need for orientation meetings, and so social events could be built into the transition process to support families in building connections with each other, as well as their new teacher. As for teachers, we learned about each other's practices. We developed some new practices together. We reviewed established practices, and most valuably of all, we built connections between the sectors. And moving forward, in their review of their experiences, I asked the families and the teachers if the two groups were to run again, what would they change? And resoundingly, the feedback from both groups was to create one group for all, as you can see by these quotes. Ngā mihi nui, thank you for listening.
Kia ora, Hazel. Thank you so much. You've given us all so much to think about with your presentation. I have a couple of questions that I'm happy to ask, and if people who are participating today would like to put these into the Q&A, I'll keep an eye out for those as well. One question I had actually, which you've just almost alluded to in that last part, is that one thing I noticed was that by having separate pages for the parents and the teachers, it enabled a vulnerability for the parents to,
Yes.
you know, you made that comment, no question is a silly question.
Yeah.
And clearly, you know, things like the after school and the lunchtime came up, which they might not have asked perhaps if the teachers had been involved. So I just wondered, you know, what you think about that and this idea of one group, one page.
Yes, that was my thinking at the start, that the parents would want to talk about parenting stuff. And if anything cropped up in their comments or comparisons between their experiences in early childhood or anything like that, I wanted it to be within that family forum where they felt confident to do so. And as you say, those questions that parents want to ask that they may not feel confident enough asking if there's teachers in that space, which can kind of create that power dynamic. But on the other side, there was a lot of comments from parents who really did appreciate their early childhood teachers' advice. And that was something they missed as they started school. They wanted that contact. They actually wanted some of the Facebook postings shared with their early childhood teachers. And reciprocally, the early childhood teachers in particular would address the postings to the children. So for some reason, they thought that the postings were going to be shared with the children, but it was made clear there were two separate groups. There was a lot of crossover. And I think it would be really interesting to explore what sort of areas parents would be confident exploring with teachers in the space, and would the conversation be as flowing? It would be very interesting to see. It really would.
Or is there a role then for the Facebook moderator to, you know, bring some of the postings together in a joint page?
That would be a really good idea. And then, yes, you can be very selective. And actually, they came up with very similar points, such as the lunchtime. They both arrived at it in a different way, but they both came up with that as their main sort of challenge for transition. A lot of similar sort of postings were made. My concern was that when the teachers started to talk about that sort of professional practice side of things, would it become too jargony or too sort of disconnected for families? But actually, they never really did. They related the postings to the children and talked about the learning for that particular child. And so that was something I kind of thought, would that happen if we went into one group? But they never really went that way. So I think it's definitely worth an exploration at some point.
Yes, yes, no, that's fascinating. And I guess there are people too who would say, you know, why Facebook, and who have concerns around digital tools. I think you covered the ethics of that and the reason that you decided to use it really well. Are there any other platforms or apps at all that you think could serve the same purposes that teachers might be familiar with or families might be familiar with?
Yes, schools are very good now. They've followed the early childhood route of those app-based technologies like Seesaw and Story Park, those kind of apps. The reason I chose Facebook at the start was that the centres that I was working with, they had different app-based technologies, and so they didn't align with each other. The school had a different app as well. So it was a case of logistically, they wouldn't be talking to one another from the same app. So I went with something that was a familiar tool to everybody. I checked in the initial questionnaire, and everybody bar one person had a Facebook account, and that one person had a joint Facebook account. So it sort of guided me to go through Facebook because the parents and the teachers already had that app sitting on their phone.
Right.
So hence why that was the one chosen. But yes, I definitely think that app-based technologies now are becoming much more sort of open and available, but there are cost implications for centres and schools for those apps, and the increase in prices have been quite phenomenal this year. Just in a recent research project I did, schools were really considering whether they were going to continue with them.
Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Yes, no, that's a really good point, because you said at the start that you had, was it 40 different centres that were feeding into the school, because many were coming from close to their parents' place of work, I think. So that's really interesting. So that's a really good argument for continuing to use Facebook, isn't it?
It's free.
Well, yes, exactly. You mentioned that the period of time that the parents were putting, perhaps, this is my wording, a little bit of pressure on you, was when their children actually started school and they wanted postings about their child. Did you feel that was quite time consuming at the time? I mean, I can see how these over time were created as part of your role, but that must have been a very busy time. I just wondered if you wanted to comment on how you managed that.
I was very lucky. I started off with a very small group, just because they all started on their 5th birthday. And so I managed to get sort of try different things with that small group until I sort of found a way that the families liked and I liked. The things with the postings were they became part of your day anyway. You would just snap a photo, quick post, done. It just became something you did. The postings were actually, we'd done the sort of preliminal phase, and I was, as a teacher, was a little bit of a loss as to how I could continue to make Facebook still relevant for my families and teachers when everything at the preliminal had been on that preparation and tools for transition and stuff for families to do at home. And that was really busy making those resources and like the Patrick stories. When the children started school, I kind of had this moment of, well, what do I do now? They're here, you know, what can I do to make this page something that's still about transition, that's still relevant and still part of these families' worlds and these teachers' world. And so that small group of children started, and I started to take some postings and put some things up on Facebook, and the viewing just shot up. People were on there, they were posting, it really connected with them. And that's a huge motivation. It didn't bother me that I was taking a lot of pictures. It just became something I did because I was actually getting that feedback that this is what they wanted. And that was the aspect of Facebook that continued right through to post-liminality, that maintained the families and the teachers' connections and actually really developed them. So it was worthwhile. It really was a good investment.
Yeah, good on you. And yes, you'll have lots of different resources now that you could call on again, of course, to use groups. So a couple of questions.
Yes.
One is just thinking that many schools have moved towards cohort entry, and I was just wondering what difference that might make, particularly around, would there be any new or different resources that you would add?
Yes and no. In some respects, the resources that are there are still highly relevant to the children starting school. There was nothing made specifically for this is the only 5-year-old starting school today. It was always made through different social scenarios that the children would face whilst at school. So it was never specifically tied to that 5-year-old start on their birthday. Cohort entry could actually make it a lot easier in some respects, because in my parents' initial questionnaire, they said they wanted to know about transition or start thinking about transition to school round about 1 term before their child started school, so around about 3 months. If the children are all starting on the same date, then that's very easy to schedule that preliminal to be 1 term in advance for all of those families who are starting on the same starting date. So in respect, I suppose it makes it easier. The children still have their social events, they're still meeting one another, and I wouldn't change that process at all for that. But the resources were definitely not targeted for a 5-year-old starting on their own. It was more about what they managed when they got there and familiarise themselves with it.
Yeah, great. So having gone through this process, would there be any other topics of interest that you think you might make videos about, for whether they're individual or cohort entry? Videos or activities? I mean, you've shown us a huge range of wonderful activities as well. Is there anything you do differently or add to it?
I think there's a lot of change goes on in schools regardless. I think there was resources I didn't share about the school's whakapapa and lots of different things that were specific to the school. So I think anybody who's starting off on this journey really needs to think about their school culture, what's specific to the school that the children are transitioning to, because the families are part of that community or want to be part of that community. So you have to make it specific to that context. So things that are going to help them find their place in the school. Cohort entry is something that possibly needs explaining. Another aspect that sort of crept in with this particular, not so much this particular group, but if children start at the beginning of the year, sort of around about that March, April time, they hit that 0-1 sort of focus, and families, our school used to give families a little bit of a choice whether their children wanted to move up to year 1 next year or move to year 2 next year. So there's little things that crop up during the year that families may not understand the full picture about. So those are sort of little aspects, and obviously the context of new entrants has changed a wee bit, and we're now entering things like structured literacy hour and structured numeracy. Those sort of aspects, it would be good to unpack them a little bit with families so they've got some idea of what that looks like.
Yeah, really good points and really good kind of future thinking for some of our participants who are here. So we could talk for a long time, but we'll stop at this point. Kia ora, Hazel, mō tō kōrero. Thank you so much for your contribution to the seminar series. You've given everyone today a great deal to think about, whether they are from the early childhood or the primary sector, to go away and discuss and to action in their settings. Ngā mihi nui ki a koe. I'll hand back to Justine now to close the seminar.
Kia ora, Helen, and ngā mihi nui ki a koe, Hazel, for your presentation. This is such a timely and important presentation, particularly as the year draws to a close, and many of our young tamariki and their whānau will be transitioning into the formal school setting or schooling sector in the new year. And what you've shared this evening is going to be a real source, I think, of ongoing reflection and discussion amongst our early childhood education community, and also the new entrant teacher community. I think we've all got, lots of really important conversations that we need to keep having with each other as we consider how we're going to further enhance communication and collaboration between educators and families, and ultimately benefit our tamariki as they transition into school. Te anō, ngā mihi nui ki a koe, Hazel. We really appreciate you sharing your findings and your insights.
Thank
To
you.
our early childhood seminar series audience, if you wish to share or revisit this presentation, please check out our early childhood seminar series YouTube channel. The recording of the seminar will be available in a couple of days. So thank you all again for joining us today. We hope to be back with you again in 2025 with more online seminars by local and international researchers and practitioners. And we will close with karakia. Me inoi tātou. Kia tau te rangi Māori o te rangi I tu iho nei, papatuanuku I tākoto nei, o te tai ao I awhi nei, ki runga I a tātou, pihei Māori ora. May the peace of the sky above, of the earth below, of the all-embracing universe rest upon us all. Behold, it is life. Ngā mihi o te kirihimeti me te tau hou. See you in 2025. Ka kite anō.